Memphis, 1985. Inside the historic Peabody Hotel ballroom, hundreds of guests gathered for a black-tie charity gala unlike any other. The chandeliers glowed gold above polished marble floors, bow ties and sequined gowns shimmered in every corner, and a grand piano, an immaculate black Steinway, stood center stage like a jewel waiting to be touched. The evening's theme celebrated American musical heritage, and the organizers had invited legends, celebrities, and donors from across the country. But no one expected what would unfold. No one knew that by the end of the night, people would witness a moment they would talk about for decades. A moment involving two icons, one present, one legendary in rumor, and a security guard who had no idea who he was stopping. Near the entrance stood an older man wearing a simple charcoal suit, sunglasses, and a hat pulled low. He walked with a careful, dignified posture, leaning lightly on a cane. His name was Samuel King Wilder, though almost no one used his real name anymore. Among a small circle of musicians, he was known simply as the King, a forgotten blues pianist from the 1940s, whose hands once set juke joints on fire and whose melodies had quietly influenced half the artists in the room, whether they knew it or not. Age and obscurity had taken much from him, but not his love for music, not the way his fingers twitched every time he heard a piano chord float through the air. Tonight he had come, hoping, just hoping, to touch the keys again. As the ballroom filled, a familiar energy moved through the crowd. Stevie Wonder had arrived. The moment his presence was announced, people rushed forward, swarming him with admiration. Stevie greeted everyone with warmth and laughter, but he felt something else too, something sharp, something emotional, coming from across the room. A presence, a history, a soul. He couldn't see Samuel Wilder, but he felt him, felt a weight in the air, like an unspoken chord waiting to be played. But before Stevie could move toward it, the first spark of trouble ignited. Samuel, the King himself, stepped quietly toward the grand piano. A lifetime of music pulled him toward it like gravity. He placed one trembling hand on the polished edge, and just as he reached for the keys, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. A security guard barked, "Sir, step away from the piano. That's for the performers only." The ballroom froze. Samuel straightened slowly. "Son," he said gently, "I was just—" "Rules are rules," the guard snapped. "Move along." The old man lowered his head, and across the room, Stevie Wonder stopped smiling. He felt something break. Stevie's head tilted sharply in the direction of the confrontation, his smile fading as if someone had pulled the warmth out of the room. Conversations dimmed. A few guests turned toward the raised voices, noticing the tension gathering near the piano. Naomi from the orchestra whispered, "Who is that man?" Another musician replied, "I don't know, but he looks important somehow." Stevie felt the shift like a ripple through the air, an emotion so heavy it almost sang. It wasn't anger, it was heartbreak, the kind that comes from someone being denied something sacred. He moved his hand toward his assistant. "Take me to the piano," he said quietly. Meanwhile, Samuel Wilder, the forgotten king, took a step back, his hand slipping from the piano's glossy surface. "I didn't mean any trouble," he murmured, his voice soft, cracking under the weight of humiliation. The security guard crossed his arms. "Sir, I don't care what you meant. You can't be touching the equipment. Now please, return to your seat." Samuel nodded slowly, the motion so small it almost wasn't a nod at all. His lips parted with a faint quiver. "Those keys, they were my whole life once." The guard scoffed. "Not tonight, they aren't." The dismissive words echoed like a slap across the ballroom. A few guests frowned. Some whispered in discomfort. Others looked away, unwilling to get involved. The vulnerability in Samuel's eyes was unmistakable, even behind the sunglasses. His fingers twitched helplessly, as if still searching for the music he'd been denied. He turned to walk away, shoulders hunched, dignity slipping through his trembling hands. And then Stevie's voice cut through the air, not loud, not angry, but full of a power that made the room stand completely still. "Excuse me," Stevie said, stepping forward with careful, deliberate steps. "Why are you stopping that man from touching the piano?" A hush swept over the ballroom. The guard stiffened, suddenly aware of who addressed him. "Mr. Wonder, sir. He isn't part of the program. He has no authorization to play." Stevie's eyebrows rose above his shades. "Authorization to play. He let out a quiet, disbelieving laugh. "Son, music doesn't ask for permission." The guard swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Stevie tilted his face slightly toward Samuel. "Sir, what's your name?" Samuel hesitated. The question felt like light in a dark room. "People used to call me the King." Stevie's expression shifted. Recognition, respect, awe. "Oh," Stevie breathed. "That King." The whole room gasped. Guests leaned forward. Musicians nearly dropped their drinks. The security guard's face drained of color, because suddenly everyone realized he had just denied a legend. And Stevie Wonder wasn't about to let that stand. Stevie stepped closer to Samuel with a reverence that spread through the entire ballroom like a quiet shockwave. "King Wilder," he said softly, as if speaking the name of someone carved into the foundation of music itself. "I grew up hearing stories about you." Samuel flinched in disbelief. "Stories? About me?" Stevie nodded slowly. "My mama used to talk about a man down in Mississippi whose fingers could make a piano confess its sins." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People leaned closer, eyes wide, realizing they weren't witnessing a random incident. They were watching one legend recognize another. Samuel's throat tightened. "That was a long time ago," he whispered. "Before the world moved on." Stevie shook his head. "The world didn't move on, King. It just forgot to look back." The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was reverent. Something monumental hung in the air. Waiting. Stevie's assistant placed his guiding hand gently on the piano, helping him locate the bench. Stevie didn't sit. Instead, he turned toward the security guard. "Young man," he said calmly, "you didn't know who he was. That's all right." The guard nodded, trembling. Stevie continued, voice growing deeper. "But we never stop someone from touching the instrument that holds their life." The ballroom erupted in applause, soft at first, then swelling. The guard lowered his head, humiliated but quietly, grateful for Stevie's grace. Samuel stood frozen, torn between pain and awe. "Stevie," he murmured, voice breaking, "I wasn't trying to cause a scene. I was just hoping maybe I could feel the keys again." Stevie reached out, finding Samuel's hand with uncanny precision. Their fingers intertwined, one legendary musician guiding another back to the place he belonged. "King," Stevie said, voice thickening with emotion, "you don't ask to feel the keys. You belong at the keys." The entire ballroom held its breath. Stevie gently placed Samuel's hand on the smooth surface of the Steinway's polished edge. Samuel's fingertips trembled, tracing the familiar curve of the instrument like a blind man rediscovering a lost friend. He drew in a sharp breath, a sound filled with 30 years of longing. Stevie stepped aside from the bench. "Sit," he said softly. Samuel hesitated. I don't know if I can. It's been so long." Stevie smiled. "Then let's remember together." The two legends, one forgotten by time, the other immortal, lowered themselves onto the bench, side by side. Stevie touched one key gently, and the note rang through the ballroom like a call. Samuel's head lifted, as if waking from a lifetime of sleep. Something ancient flickered in his stillness, and then, with the entire room watching, King Wilder placed both hands on the piano. The world seemed to stop. For a long moment, Samuel didn't press a single key. His fingers hovered above the ivory, trembling, not from age, but from the weight of returning to a place he thought he'd lost forever. The ballroom remained utterly still, as if even the chandeliers were holding their breath. Stevie waited, patient and steady beside him. "Go on, King," he whispered. "Let your hands remember." Samuel swallowed hard, his shoulders rising with a shudder. He lowered his fingers onto the keys, and the first sound he produced was barely more than a whisper, a soft, wavering chord that trembled, like an old man taking his first step after a long illness. But beneath the shakiness was history, soul, truth. Stevie inhaled sharply, recognizing it instantly. "There it is," he murmured. "That's the man they told stories about." The second chord came stronger. Samuel's fingers, stiff at first, began to loosen, searching instinctively for the shapes they once knew by heart. He closed his eyes behind the sunglasses, letting memory guide him instead of sight. A small smile crept across his lips, tired, cracked, but unmistakably joyful. I can still feel it," he whispered, voice barely audible. A ripple of emotional gasps spread across the ballroom. Guests pressed hands to their mouths, Some wiped tears before they even realized they were crying, because they weren't just watching an old man play a piano, they were witnessing a soul being restored, a man rediscovering the piece of himself he'd buried decades ago. Stevie added a soft, grounding harmony beside him, gentle enough not to overshadow, strong enough to support. It was the musical equivalent of placing a hand on Samuel's back and saying, "I've got you." Samuel's fingers began moving faster, still shaky, still imperfect, but growing with each passing second. A melody emerged, bluesy and aching, like smoke rising from a long-forgotten juke joint. People in the audience whispered in awe, recognizing the style even if they didn't know the man. This is old-school Mississippi blues, a sound nearly extinct, resurrected tonight by its original master. Samuel's head bowed forward, his body swaying gently as he found the rhythm he thought age had stolen. And then something incredible happened. Stevie joined him fully. Their hands danced across the keys in a duet that wasn't planned, wasn't rehearsed, wasn't written. It came from instinct, memory, and pure emotional connection. Stevie played with the sensitivity of a man guiding someone back to themselves. And Samuel played like he was 30 again. The room erupted, not in applause, but in stunned, breathless wonder, because the king was alive again, and everyone could feel it. As the duet blossomed, the music swelled through the ballroom with a force that felt almost supernatural. Two generations of genius, one remembered, one nearly forgotten, wove their histories together in real time. Stevie laid down warm, soulful chords that wrapped around Samuel's raw, blues-soaked melodies like a loving arm around a trembling shoulder. Samuel's hands, gaining confidence with every passing second, began to move with surprising agility. His fingers glided into runs filled with that old juke joint fire, rough, emotional, unmistakably him. Gasps erupted around the room. People turned to one another in disbelief. Is this really happening? My God, where did he learn to play like that? Some guests recognized the style instantly. A few older musicians whispered his name through trembling lips. That's King Wilder. The king is playing again. Stevie matched Samuel note for note, not copying him, but uplifting him. He filled the spaces Samuel left open, leaving room for the older man to shine. Their chemistry was immediate, magnetic, and deeply moving. These weren't two pianists performing. They were two souls talking, one speaking in the language of the Delta blues, the other in the language of Motown soul. And somehow, without sight, without rehearsal, without a single word exchanged, they understood each other perfectly. Samuel's body began to sway, and a low hum rose from his throat, a sound so gritty and heartfelt that several audience members covered their mouths to stifle their tears. It was the hum of a man remembering who he used to be, who he still was, beneath the years that had buried him. Then Samuel did something no one expected. He lifted one hand from the piano, raised it slightly into the air, and let out a single, trembling, vocal riff. The sound was aged, rasped by time, but so soaked in emotion it stunned the crowd. Stevie immediately dropped his accompaniment to the lightest whisper, letting Samuel's fragile voice take center stage. It was a voice that carried decades of smoky bars, dusty roads, broken hearts, and silent rooms. The blues weren't just a style for him, they were his blood, his story, his truth. And tonight, he was telling it again. The audience was captivated, silent, breathless, reverent. They weren't just witnessing a performance, they were witnessing a resurrection. A man long forgotten by the world being brought back to life by the one musician who could feel his heartbeat from across a room. Stevie's throat tightened with emotion. Behind his glasses, tears formed. He whispered, barely audible, "Play, king, play." And the king did, with everything he had left. The final minutes of their duet hit the ballroom like a tidal wave. Samuel's fingers, weathered and thin, moved with a vigor that stunned everyone, each note carrying the weight of a life fully lived. His playing wasn't flawless, but it was honest, overflowing with a kind of soul that technique could never replicate. Stevie leaned in closer, matching Samuel's intensity, his own hands flying across the keys with a fluidity only he possessed. The energy between them built higher and higher until the entire room felt electrified, as if history itself were being rewritten on those ivory keys. Guests stood slowly from their seats, compelled by an invisible force, unable to stay still while witnessing something so raw, so powerful, so impossibly alive. Then, just as the music reached its emotional peak, Stevie abruptly softened his playing, pulling back like a tide, receding from the shore. Samuel responded instinctively, his hands slowing, settling into a gentle reflective pattern, one that sounded like a farewell and a prayer at the same time. His voice trembled, out once more, barely louder than a whisper. "Been so long, so long." The words hung suspended in the air like smoke. Many in the audience broke completely, tears streaming down faces young and old. A woman whispered, "It's like he's talking to the piano." Another murmured, "No, he's talking to his past." Stevie shifted into a warm, steady chord progression, holding Samuel up like a friend supporting another through his final steps. Together, they landed on one last shared chord, deep, resonant, meaningful, and let it ring until the very vibration faded into silence. What followed was not applause. Not at first. It was stillness, a stunned, breathless quiet that no one dared disturb. Samuel sat motionless, tears slipping beneath his sunglasses, his chest rising and falling with shaky breaths. He whispered, voice breaking, "I thought the music was gone. I thought I was gone." Stevie reached over, covering Samuel's trembling hands with his own. "King, the music never leaves us. Sometimes it just waits." Those words detonated in the hearts of everyone listening. Then, finally, the applause erupted. Thunderous, explosive, emotional. People shouted, cried, lifted their hands to the ceiling. Some even called out, "King, King Wilder," as if resurrecting his name by sheer force of love. Samuel gasped at the sound, at hearing his old stage name shouted again after 30 long years. Stevie rose to his feet, lifting Samuel's arm into the air like a champion. Returning home, the ovation grew even louder, and in that moment, Samuel Wilder was not forgotten, not invisible, not dismissed. He was a king again. As the standing ovation roared through the ballroom, Samuel stood trembling beside Stevie, overwhelmed by the tidal wave of love washing over him. He reached up with a shaking hand and removed his sunglasses for the first time all night. Behind them were eyes clouded by age, but shining with something far brighter, gratitude, rediscovery, and a spark of the man he once was. People gasped softly. This wasn't just an elderly musician reclaiming his gift. It was a resurrection of dignity, of identity, of purpose. Stevie leaned closer, his voice warm and steady through the applause. "King Wilder," he announced into the microphone. "For those who don't know, this man helped build the foundation of the music you hear today." The crowd erupted again, louder, prouder, as Samuel covered his mouth with a trembling hand. Struck, speechless, Stevie continued, "Before there were records, before the charts, before people knew my name, there were players like him, pouring their souls into pianos in little bars and dusty rooms." Samuel's chest rose sharply, his breath catching as memories flooded back. Sweat-filled nights in smoky clubs, coins tossed into jars, young musicians watching him from shadowed corners. He never thought any of it mattered, and yet here he was, being honored by one of the greatest musicians in history. Stevie placed a hand on Samuel's back. "Tonight, you didn't just play the piano," Stevie said softly. "You reminded all of us where this music comes from." The audience's applause softened into something deeper, a rhythmic clap, a pulse of respect, gratitude, and collective emotion. Naomi from the orchestra wiped tears from her face. Even the security guard who had stopped Samuel earlier was crying, head bowed in remorse. With the room still trembling from emotion, Stevie guided Samuel down from the bench. Samuel paused, touching the polished wood of the piano one last time, the same way a man touches an old friend after years of separation. "Thank you," he whispered to Stevie, his voice breaking. Stevie shook his head. "Thank you, King. You brought the music tonight." As they stepped away from the piano, guests reached out to touch Samuel's hand, his shoulder, offering words of admiration. He walked slowly through the crowd, but his posture had changed. His back was straighter, his steps steadier, For the first time in decades, he walked like the man he used to be, the king. As the night came to a close, the story spread through the ballroom like wildfire. How a forgotten blues legend stepped toward a piano, how he was stopped, how Stevie Wonder intervened, and how the two played a duet that shook the room to its core. People would tell the story for years. Some would embellish it, some would simplify it, but the truth would remain the same. An old man touched a piano, a legend took his side, and music history breathed again.